One of the easiest ways to understand what Enlightenment thinking is actually to understand what it opposed, right? So we're going to talk a ton about what Enlightenment thinkers believed, but I want to start at least by talking a little bit about what they opposed. And they opposed five types of thought in general, or five social forces, or five social trends, roughly between 1650 and 1800. And again, we're talking about lots of different thinkers. There's lots of variations within these thinkers, and many historians have spent book after book, career after career, on the distinctions between some of the small differences between somebody like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, just to name two off the top of my head. But nevertheless, I think that these hold up across this a century and a half and across lots of different science-influenced thinkers in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The five principles, ideas that Enlightenment thinkers really opposed were myth, tradition, personal revelation, superstition, and unearned authority. And I'll go through each of those very quickly. So when we think about myths, right, we think about stories that are passed down through generations. And these are untested conclusions that represent broad ideas about people. So you can think about lots of myths about cultures, for instance, and many of these converge on, and actually are, stereotypes. Southerners are nice. People in Minnesota like to think of themselves as having a species of Minnesota nice. There's stereotypes, myths about French people as being rude. And you get the point, right? These are untested conclusions about big, broad swaths of people. Enlightenment thinkers were incredibly opposed to the social consequences of people purveying myths about other people. Another thing that Enlightenment thinkers were incredibly opposed to was tradition, right? It was tradition in medieval Europe, especially where the Enlightenment really took root, for society to be organized hierarchically, right? It wasn't just economically hierarchical, although it was also in terms of nobility and different lines of succession. And this nobility meant that you come from a quote-unquote good house, or a house that has nobility, and then the rest of us are serfs and peons who have no nobility to our names. So these traditions of social organizations, Enlightenment thinkers says, these aren't the result of any kind of a rational or scientific process. This is just because you were able to take a certain amount of money, or occupy a certain amount of land, or occupy privileged positions within the church. These are not the way society should be organized. It just happens to be the way society is organized, and we can change it. And human beings have the effort and have the capacity to make progress in their world through directed scientific action. The third category of thought, or the third type of thinking that Enlightenment figures really opposed, and this is where it can be incredibly controversial religiously, is revelation. Right? If you think about many of the famous stories across religious traditions, whether it's Islam or in Christianity or Judaism or Mormonism or anything like that, it is a story about somebody who had a revelation in a place where nobody else saw that revelation, whether it's in a cave or on top of a mountain or something like that. God has revealed some truth to a particular individual without anybody else seeing this happen, and then that individual comes and reports that revealed truth to a community. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers fought amongst themselves and with the wider world about religion in general, and most Enlightenment thinkers were actually Christians. So this is not to say that Enlightenment thought was entirely about being skeptical about religion. It was just skepticism of revealed truth, of revelation as a source of religious faith. In fact, many Enlightenment thinkers, some who were deists, some who were atheists, many who were Christians, all thought that God, whoever that God was, had given human beings the possibility of being rational, and therefore it was their duty as faithful believers to use rational argumentation, to use deduction, and to use science to prove the existence of a watchful, thoughtful, compassionate God. The fourth type of thinking that Enlightenment thinkers opposed was superstition. Much of this can obviously be religious in nature, but much of it is not. But to give a religious example, we still, to this day, have a superstition about 13. The 13th floor is often a floor you'll never see on a hotel elevator. It'll jump straight from 12 all the way to 14, and that has ancient roots, that suspicion of 13. And then finally, Enlightenment thinkers questioned authority. They questioned all authority in general. Why do you have power over me? By what virtue do you have power over me, whether that's a monarch or some sort of local lord, local magistrate? but especially unearned authority. If somebody was born into a particular caste, if somebody was born into a position of privileged authority because of their family, because of their family's position, because of their family's line of succession next to the king, your birth was an accident in the sense of where you were born in the strata of society, and therefore you had an authority that was not earned. It was not based on merit, and it certainly was not based on reason. And so, in a general sense, Enlightenment thinkers wanted to reorganize the world according to scientific reason, and in so doing, they wanted to do away with myth, tradition, personal revelation, superstition, and unearned authority.